All right. So this will be the housing production strategy meeting number 3, I believe. Wow, 3 already. So I'll hand it over to Beth and Leanne, who are our consultants for the housing production strategy, and they'll take it from here.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. I'm glad to see you all here. Faye, if you can give me permission to share my screen, that'll be helpful. So we're right in the middle of developing the housing production strategy. We've got our potential list of actions that we'll talk about with you here. And from that, at our next meeting, we'll have brought more details about those actions back. And from those details, that'll all be going into the housing production strategy report itself. So this is building on itself. Most of what you've seen at the meetings, you'll see in the final report. So while the report will be long, it won't be unfamiliar to you, a lot of it. So here is our agenda for this evening, this afternoon rather. We want to talk with you first about the initiatives that we included in the memorandum we sent you. And then we'll talk with you about particular actions. I've got some questions as we go through. I have some idea of order that we go, but if you guys end up wanting to hop around, that's fine. The important things here is that one, we get your feedback on the initiatives, and you know, if there's anything we're overlooking. And then 2, that we get your feedback on the actions. Do we have the right ones? Which ones do you think are most important to include? Or more importantly, right now, which ones do you think should be left out of the HPS? So we're trying to continue to narrow down, but make sure that we have the right actions. So I was reading over it this morning and I was pretty pleased with what I was reading. It sounds like I'm tooting my own horn, but I'm really not. It's that staff has been very helpful on this. So is it okay to start with the initiatives? Okay, so what the initiatives are is essentially a way of grouping the actions, so we know what each action is intended to do. You can see that some actions are used in different initiatives in different ways. And part of what we're trying to do is not have an HPS that has very similar actions, but they're geared towards different groups. So for instance, in an HPS I did last year, in reading over it again, I'm like, what's the difference between these 2 actions? Oh yeah, one of them's looking at housing that's affordable at this level, and another one's looking at housing affordable at that level. So the initiatives that we're looking at are an initiative about supporting development of low and moderate income affordable rental housing. So that's housing that is affordable at about 50% of median family income, or about $48,000 for a household of 4, on up to 120% of median family income, or about $116,000. So this is housing that will range from rental housing on the lower side of rental cost at $1,200, and also range up potentially to lower cost housing that could be purchased, ownership housing. This is what we would call, what we do is we call this market rate housing. So this isn't built by affordable housing providers. It's built generally by private market developers. And so some of the key actions in here are things like, really this one shouldn't have a square over it. Supporting development of market rate affordable housing, that's what we're talking about. Potentially land banking may have a role in this. Looking at permitting fees and the MUPD, the multi-unit property tax exemption, that's especially about this. And then some of the zoning pieces. And of course, down here, supporting fair housing law and looking at housing policies through the lens of racial and social equity. So that's what this initiative is really about, and we'll update this table with a few minor changes. The next initiative is about increasing opportunities for affordable home ownership. That's typically at about the same income level we were just talking about, but you generally speaking don't see housing that's affordable at the lower part of that income level at $45,000, $48,000 a year. And so that initiative, really land banking is a really important part of that initiative. Looking at SDC reductions potentially, or backfilling SDC through other means. Looking at reducing permitting fees that can play into this. The major players in this kind of thing are really going to be your land banks and your land trust. There's a few other things that apply for this. You know, your fair housing laws and your issues around racial and social equity. And then of course your funding sources all end up being pretty important in this one. So that's affordable ownership housing. People are really usually excited about affordable home ownership housing and want to see a lot more of it happening. And I can certainly understand that, but understand that producing a unit of for home ownership that's affordable at some of those income levels takes a lot of money and doesn't have good federal or state funding sources in most cases. There's some state funding, but there's really not good financial support behind that outside of the city. So then our next initiative is about encouraging development of income restricted affordable housing. So that's most of the things that we'll talk about supporting affordable housing development. So it's items like your land banking strategy. That's a pretty important one here, and we'll update that so it's got a darkened square on it. Your system development charge and your permitting fees, backfilling or exempting those in some ways. Looking at density bonuses to support development of this housing. This housing is usually income restricted. It's always income use restricted. It's usually multifamily housing types. Let's see. And then of course, the same things with fair housing, etc. Funding for this often comes through the federal government and through the state. You'll have things like low-income housing tax credits. This kind of housing is funded with low-income housing tax credits and other state and federal funds. And then preserving your existing low and moderate income affordable housing. So, you know, it's really going to be mostly about things about preserving your income restricted affordable housing. So what happens when your low income housing tax credits lapse? Are you going to lose that housing that's affordable? Preserving housing in manufactured parks. Some of these other things also fit in here a little bit, but those are the major ones. So talking about these, less the exact, you know, primary focus, secondary focus piece, but talking about these initiatives, do they sound like the right initiatives to be looking at, or are we overlooking something? We're looking for ways to group these so we can talk intelligently about how they build on each other. And the city may want to use these as frames for, this is what we're trying to do with these different actions.
I think the encouragement of development and the development of low income, the first and third there,
yeah,
are things that, while they're great and I would love to see it, you're going to find more pushback from the community on.
mm-hmm.
But I think they are the most important. Having grown up in those kind of housing situations, they admittedly have their own issues that come with them that can cause problems in the community. But they also, there's me and a lot of other people that would have been homeless as children if those things didn't exist. And we're running into a lot of homelessness in the area right now. And if we can get those people stable and stuff. That should be a top priority, I feel. As far as affordable home ownership on the other side of it is, it's a great thing. It would be fantastic, but like you said, a lot of money. It's a lot of money to put out for not as much results as the income-based affordable housing would be.
Income restricted affordable housing, yeah?
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. My thought on that is if we omitted that initiative, then that would be a problem also. Okay. Other takes on these? Are these the right initiatives? We might reorder them. I often don't start with the income restricted affordable housing, because that sometimes puts people off. But I think it's also the most important piece. Joyce, you've got looks on your face.
Yeah, I'll unmute myself. So the way I kind of look at these is like someone in their different seasons of life, and that would be met with like, so, I look at income restricted, and I think definitely more of like the elderly disabled situation where that income is less likely to change, as opposed to that balance between the preservation and the development of those low to mods. And then how do we get people further out of that cycle then with the home ownership piece? So I think I'm understanding that like we kind of build, if it exists, let's go to it. If we don't, let's get some. And then if we can get people out of renting where they build wealth, great, in home ownership. But if they never leave rental life, they're going to end up later in life needing income restricted units.
And income restricted units are certainly occupied by families also. And
Right,
individuals, it's not uncommon.
Yeah, I was just thinking there might be families who have income restricted just because their head of house is either disabled or elderly, right? So I guess grandparents raising.
Or people who are who simply work in the service industry with very low pay.
I see what you're saying. So when they're saying income restricted versus low and moderate, when we use low, was it low and moderate median incomes? Is that what we were using?
So we will state this a little bit better when we look at it, but the income restricted is generally speaking below 50% of median family income, so below $48,000. The low and moderate, low and middle is between 48,000 and up to 116,000.
Right.
Generally speaking, when you're looking at building new multifamily housing, multifamily that's affordable somewhere above 80%. A lot of the time the market's building that, or it's building somewhere near that. But when you look at households for home ownership, achieving home ownership when you're earning $77,000 as a household of four, that's just not affordable in Newberg.
But then my question was, didn't you kind of look at like how much we needed in the income restricted versus in the low to moderate? And didn't that influence kind of part of how we came up then with these priorities? I feel like you showed us that.
I did. Give
Okay,
me
cool.
1 moment to get the PowerPoint open with that, because I didn't include that in this, and I can't remember if I included it in the last PowerPoint or not. I suspect I did. Yes, it's this happy house. And so when you're talking low to moderate, the income restricted, you're talking about nearly 40%. 37% of households in Newberg currently. So when you're talking in the low income and the middle income, that's about 55% of households in Newberg. If you think about it, households with lower income need more help than households with higher income.
Yeah, actually, that was my question then, since we can't take every path at all times. Is that part of how you're going to consult us, is how we kind of move these things through in a timely way, but also just realistically, so that those basically that the people who are hurting don't keep hurting as bad for as long.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, the items where we would recommend that the city spend the most resources, especially of money, of money, staff time, land, all of that, is essentially down here and maybe as far down as that. And some attention needs to be paid, you know, between low and middle income for affordable home ownership. And some land trusts, they go for affordable home ownership down to 60% of median family income and below. So it all depends on what land trust you're working with. So. Larry, I think you had something to say.
Well, I was just going to say, I think these four
This off.
kind of cover the range pretty well. And, you know, again, I'm a little concerned that we don't add too many initiatives, because then you just don't do a good job with any of them. You know, I mean,
Sure.
if you have too many things on their plate, they're not, you know, nothing's going to get done. So,
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, like I said, this kind of covers the range, both rental and ownership, and kind of from maybe young families up to, you know, retired people or whatever as well. And so I feel like it captures, you know, kind of the heart of probably what's most important for us to do.
Okay. And then Elise or Beatrice, I'm sorry, I don't know which of you is also on the committee.
I joined the committee here today just to observe, just with the recent petition that was circulating. I'm become more interested in learning more about the efforts of initiating and developing low-income housing here in Newberg. So at this point, I just wanted to be an observer and see what's happening. And I appreciate you already having put in so much work. Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. Does anybody else have any comments?
So I was just going to say, Beth, Elise Yarnell Holloman is our council liaison.
Okay, thank you. So do you have anything you want to add at this point? I'm not positive if you can unmute. And if you don't now, or you can't, then we'll loop back with you, or you can talk when we're a little bit further along.
I have one quick question, Beth, about the preservation strategy. So do we already have like an inventory, and we know which private landlords or which property management companies have that, and then we just try to keep that at that rate? Or how do we know if people are in that space of making their rentals affordable?
So when you look at income restricted affordable rental housing, that's all going to have low income housing tax credits in it. And we know information about those because the state keeps a database of those, and the state's keeping an eye on that. We'll talk about the purpose of that strategy in a few minutes. And then the other big preservation strategy is really about preserving manufactured home parks. And where those are is known in Newberg, and we'll talk about that action in a few minutes. But those are the bigger preservation strategies.
Okay, so that column that said preserve had lumped those two into it, the LITICs and the manufactured homes. I just didn't know if there was another form of inventory out there I didn't see.
Well, you've got your naturally occurring low income, naturally occurring affordable housing. And so that's housing that's just out there, and rents on that just happen to be lower. And why are they lower? Well, they could be owned by somebody who just isn't paying a lot of attention to increases in rents and just hasn't been increasing their rents, or they could be lower because they're in really poor condition. And so the city could have an action to go out and try to identify those, and then try to work with the owners to keep rents low. And certainly other cities are attempting to do this. That's a very staff intense approach. And there's not a whole lot of tools to, what is it the city can give the owner to keep the housing lower cost? Well, you could use the multi-unit tax exemption potentially, but that probably only applies to multi-story, apartment buildings. That wouldn't apply to your little cottage, or, your standalone mobile home, manufactured home.
I would think that like habitat homes would also fit in this category. And especially, I mean, Habitat has had a practice and if people are ready to sell their home, buying it back and rehabbing and keeping it in the stock of affordable. And then even the latest few have been where we've gotten grants where the property at least is in a trust for 60 years or whatever for affordable as well. So it seems like those would fit.
And Larry, is this something that Habitat already does?
Yeah.
Is there an action that Habitat needs from the city to continue doing that?
Well, I mean, the city has worked well with Habitat for a long time, and it actually has waived fees and some other kinds of things. Has even given a piece of land at one point where the dog park used to be, and so there's a pretty good relationship, and has been supportive in Habitat's role of not providing lots and lots, I mean, it's like 1 or 2 a year, but to continue to chip away that way.
And so maybe this is something that we should mention in what the city already does, and it'll continue doing. So Leanne, if you could make a note of that, then we'll get that in the right place.
I mean, that's the thing. From what I've seen, the city has done a good job already of, I mean, even with the lot sizes and all the kinds of things that have been done over the last several years to at least make it possible, to have things maybe be affordable, because we worked like with Sherwood or others, and they're still with much larger lot sizes and minimum sizes and all that kind of stuff. So
we've got some good stuff about that coming up in a few moments. So
Beth, I would just add to Joyce's question about inventory. So yeah, the low income tax credit state has it. We have inventory on the manufactured home. Habitat has its inventory for their housing product that they do. What we will be creating in the future is with the construction excise tax and entities that access that, the city will be developing an inventory as well of all the projects that we're investing in for that affordability period of 60 years.
So that's probably a good thing to note somewhere in here, that we understand all of those inventories existing. And that the city will also be looking at that. So. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that what happens is the preserving becomes more difficult because there's so many breaks that we have listed that we can give to developers, but not so much talk about possibly something along the lines of, if they continue to maintain affordable housing after the tax credits run out, give them a property tax deduction for that.
So what typically happens with low-income housing tax credits is, as they're beginning to expire, the state is talking, and the city can and should be involved in these conversations, talking to the owner of those facilities and saying, would you like new low-income housing tax credits in exchange for doing renovation or updates to your building? And so, for instance, there's one, just like if I stuck my head out the window, I could see it here, that 30 years later, its low-income housing tax credits ran out. It was senior affordable. The city sure didn't want to lose it as affordable stock. And so they essentially made that deal, new low-income housing tax credits, and definitely needed renovations done to the building. So now it's affordable for 30 years or longer again. So that's the process that happens with that. So, well, let's go talk about these things. If we wanted to look more into preservation, we could be looking at something like a, low interest loan program or grant program for rehabilitation of housing for low income households or something like that. That's another approach to preservation. So let's talk this through, and we can always return to that if that's okay. All right, so looking down here, as we're thinking about the different strategies, different actions, what we're keeping an eye on is what affordability level do they address? So for instance, low income restricted housing, it's really more about the less than 50% of MFI, a little bit about this up to 60% of MFI. What's the potential impact for development? I think we define that as between, for small impact, that's between 1 and 3% of the forecast of new housing. So say up to 95 units for small. When you're talking about a large impact, that's up to about 320 new housing units. Might this result in that? Administrative complexity. A low administrative complexity means that there's some staff time. It may require some review by the planning commission, may require adoption by city council. Not too expensive to fund if it costs specific money. And then on to high administrative complexity. It's a lot of staff time. There's a lot of review and hearings from planning commission and or council, and it may have big financial impacts. Feasibility is really about how is the community going to react to it? Is the community going to not be concerned about it? So it's more feasible. On the less feasible side, perhaps there'll be significant concern from different stakeholder groups or the public at large or elected officials. So that's less feasible. On flexibility, does the action potentially work with multiple other strategies, or is it very specifically focused on one outcome? And so like the multi-unit tax exemption, it's got a small to moderate impact, medium complex, more feasible, and its flexibility, it works on a very specific set of items. So it's actually a little less flexible. Just because it doesn't score as well on some of these doesn't mean the city shouldn't do it. It's got a specific thing that's looking for. The same thing is true with land banking. Its complexity is high, but its flexibility is also, it's more flexible, and it can have a large impact depending on how much land we're talking about and if land trusts get involved. And it's useful across all income levels. So that's what we're thinking about as we're evaluating these different actions. Joyce, did you have a question? Okay. So I'd like to step through the actions and making sure that we're answering your questions about the actions. If there are any that you think should be left out or anything you think specifically should be kept, I'd like to get those notes here. And all of the details about the actions are in the poorly printed out memorandum that I have here that I'll be looking at some. Does anybody have any one particular that they're just dying to talk about? Or should I step through these in an order that makes some sense to me? I don't want to keep anybody in suspense if they're burning.
And I admit that I am most curious about land banking and least familiar with that. So could I please ask for that one in advance?
Sure. So how about I hit that one second?
Yeah.
All right. So what as I was reading through the memorandum again this afternoon, and you go through these things and you think about things that need to be changed. What occurred to me is the supporting development of income restricted affordable housing. That's not so much an action in of itself. That's really captured in the initiatives. The actions on that are action E, land bank, action F, which is the reducing system development charges, action G, administrative fee reductions, And action I, potential density bonus. And so that might be one that we want to, as an action, do away with and just let it be in the initiatives. And I'll come back and ask you guys that question in a few minutes. This action could also be targeted if we wanted to look at specific types of income restricted housing. But I think your nonprofits may well come to you and you know, have specific proposals. So we could, you know, specifically be talking about, are we looking at need for rapid rehousing or more permanent supportive housing? The answer to that one is yes. Transitional housing, you know, the city could be picking out these pieces to specifically focus on, or it could work with its nonprofit partners and see what they're proposing, because they're going to be paying a lot of attention to what the local housing needs are. So I'm going to hop on to land banking. So a land banking strategy, what we've got here is a strategy that's including, this is strategy E, that's including a few different ideas. So one, the land bank. When you have control of the land, control of the site, you being the city, say, then you can decide what you want to have developed there, as long as there's anybody to develop it. So for instance, Hood River purchased some land, and they purchased it with the intention that it was going to become affordable housing. They didn't know what type of affordable housing. And so they issued a request for proposals, and they got affordable housing developers to reply. And what eventually they chose was a mixed income affordable housing type. And they know they need to do certain things to make financial feasibility work. But they put the land in, so they have control of the site. And they have control of the development agreement with the developers, but the developer, of course, has to agree. So this is a public-private partnership here. And so that's one form of land banking. The city either purchases the land or the city already owns the land and it's surplus. So another instance, in Hood River, they had some parkland that they never wanted to develop as parkland because it was in a dumb area for a park. And so they tried to use that for affordable housing, and people in the neighborhood used the fact that it was parkland to completely revolt and managed to stop that development because they wanted to see more parkland, even if that was a not good area for it. So there's the, you know, city-owned land that's surplus, purchasing a property specifically, or the city, if it had gobs of money, could donate funds to a land bank. So who's the land bank run by? Well, that all depends. The city could run its own formal or informal land bank. I would imagine that it might be a more informal land bank, or a nonprofit could run a land bank where the city essentially donates land or donates funds to that land bank. So there's lots of different ways that a land bank could work, and you have to work out all these administrative details in order to decide what you're doing, and that's going to take some effort. So there are questions about that part of the land bank, and then I'm going to go on and talk about land trusts. Joyce, you had your hand up.
Actually, I was going to ask you about land trusts, so I'll just be quiet.
Okay, no problem. Are there other questions about land banking? And so realize with this that when we get to the end of the HPS, part of what we're going to have is a description of the strategy. That's, for this one, it's going to be 2 or 3 pages long, and it's going to include some questions and some implementation steps. And it'll include some schedule by which the city is doing this. And this particular one is going to be complicated, and I'm predicting it will take potentially, depending on what it ends up being, at least a year, maybe, 2 or 3 years. And then there's the ongoing, okay, we've decided what we're doing. What are we putting into that land bank, and how are we dealing with that? So this is not going to be a roadmap to exactly doing it. It's going to be, as much as we can, implementation steps. Essentially, the city council is going to have a lot of questions that it needs to work through. So we're going to keep Mary well employed with this. So then you've got a land bank. Okay, what do you do with that land bank? Well, you could give some of the land in the land bank to your income restricted affordable housing developers, and that's part of the city's input into that. Certainly, I've seen that happen in a number of different cities where you've got a nonprofit who is developing housing that'll have low-income housing tax credits, and it's income restricted below 60% of median family income. The city doesn't have to worry about, is that land going to be used for low-income households? Because that's the purpose of what's going to be developed on it. And there's, you know, agreements, I'm sure, between the city and the nonprofit doing the development. That doesn't require a land trust. If you want to look at affordable housing development for ownership, that certainly starts to require something like a land trust, or you could look at a housing cooperative also. So a land trust is something like Proud Ground. It's a nonprofit usually. They own the land where housing is built on. Most of the time, they do the development of the housing themselves, and then they look for income qualifying households. And the level of affordability, so the level of income required, is going to, of course, depend on what the land trust is doing. Are they targeting really low income households? Is that what they're trying to do? Are they trying to go to the low and the middle income households? Different land trusts do different things. But if there was a land trust that was doing this kind of work, then the city could take land from that it's publicly identified or that's put into the land bank and essentially give it to that land trust. And the land trust is doing the work of making sure that when the house is sold, usually there's some agreement about how much equity the low-income household gets out of the house. They don't get the full equity. I see Larry nodding because this is right at the edge of what Habitat does. And so he could probably explain some of the stuff a little bit better than I could. But the idea is that the household has the opportunity to be a homeowner, and they have the opportunity to grow some wealth, but they don't get all of the wealth, all of the potential increase in the housing value when it's sold.
Well, and that's, you know, the last couple of sites where the last one that we built, that Habitat built, and then the next one that's on our the plan is, you know, we got some grants more from the state or even through the state Habitat. I can't even remember exactly where they come from, but basically to help with both the purchase and the development cost of that land into these. But again, then the land is in this trust for 60 years or whatever. You know, it gets a little bit away from our mission of helping people build wealth, because they don't necessarily, I mean, we're doing it basically as like a condo. So they own the building, but not the land. And so they are, you know, they will get at least everything back that they've paid into it, which, if nothing else, it's a savings plan for them, you know, that they, you know, if they're there for 10 years, they will get all that they paid into it. But they're not, you know, it's not gaining value beyond that. Now, other, you know, the normal kind of Habitat model is, you know, they own the land. Again, anytime up until they've paid off their mortgage, if they want to sell it, we buy it back. But once they've paid off their mortgage, at that point, it really becomes, they can sell it for market value if they want. So now that's 30 years or whatever, but still. So anyway, there's all different ways to do that, you know, and even, you know, in Newberg, the thing that's hardest in a lot of ways in doing it is finding the land and being able to afford the land. You know, I mean, it's just, there's not a lot of it available, and it's very expensive. And if you're having to pay market rate for the the property, plus if there's a lot of development involved in being able to build on it, it pretty quickly prices nonprofits out of the market.
And so that's why the city's main role here is the land bank, and then its partnerships with a land trust or a housing cooperative, which is similar to a land trust, but you've got a cooperative corporation or co-op that owns the land and the units. And again, you're looking at ownership of benefits in a similar way as you did in land trusts. In Springfield, there's been a cooperative that's been doing some really interesting work. If we haven't already, we can share with you an article that one of my colleagues wrote about that land co-op or that housing co-op. So Leanne, if you note that we'll send Emily's report along. Joyce, you had a question?
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand that the trust is the entity that allows us to generate the revenue for the beneficiaries, whereas the bank itself doesn't always have those mechanisms. So for example, if we wanted to have then like a mental health trust for the land, we could take those revenues and put them toward the things like the permanent supportive housing components. Is that right? Like we can use the trust to specify and generate revenue for the initiatives? Or
You're thinking about these really, really differently. So a land bank is land. We got land. A land trust is an organization that is building housing, selling housing to lower income households, and making sure that that housing remains affordable. There's in something like this, you're using the term trust as something that revenue is put into, and there's not that concept here. So the land trust, it's usually a nonprofit organization that it does its own fundraising in some way, and the interaction with the city is usually about, does the city have land that it's either bought or that it is just surplus that can be used to support housing development. Like, for instance, if Doug went to Larry and say, hey, I got 5 acres of land out here in a good area. Does Habitat want to build some housing on it? Let's talk. I bet Larry would be pretty darn excited about that. Somebody like Proud Ground, they're a land trust that's up in the Portland area. They might be pretty excited about that. They're working outside of Portland a fair bit. And there are other land trusts. I don't remember their name. So there's not a concept of money accumulating in the bank, which is, I think, what you were referring to with a mental health trust.
Yeah, I spent some time up in the state of Alaska, and we do have a mental health land trust group that and they do cash, and they do non-cash. I'm sorry, they do land and non-cash assets, including like timber, real estate, etc. And they do acquire land, and then they use it for beneficiary projects. So they have both things that they're banking on, but they actually have like their own set of beneficiaries to address these uglier, harder issues about building housing, for harder people. So I didn't know.
A different thing, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that in Oregon. I don't think that concept exists here. Mary or Leanne might have information that I don't have. So, okay. All right. So are there other questions about this strategy?
My only question, or more of a statement, would be I would love to see this happen, but it would take a lot of funding. As Larry was getting at, the land around here is expensive. And so in order to fund that, I don't think we'll be able to fund that without definitely having all 3 of the funding sources that it says down there at the bottom. Like, if we were to even not have one of those, then there's no way we'd be able to buy enough land to actually make a difference. Like,
well, you've already got CET and you've got urban renewal.
Yeah.
The big question mark is the general obligation bond.
Which I
And
think
I
you can
think
get
that-
people on board with, sad to say, but if the land you were looking to buy was not near the current neighborhoods and schools, if it was more of on the outer side of the city, you would be able to probably pull more backing. Just because, God bless
Sure.
the people of Newberg, they want to help, just not in their backyard.
I live in South Eugene. Let me tell you, we want to help, but not here.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a problem. But as far as the urban development, the only other issue I would have with that in relation to land trust would be the fact of making sure that it's going then into affordable housing or low income housing or whatever, because urban renewal, as I've seen it used in the past, has had a big problem with basically, for lack of a better word, gentrifying an area and just making it more expensive for people. Because the city gives a
And-
bunch of money, improves everything, and then just the costs go up.
how the urban renewal funds are used is really determined in the urban renewal plan. And I would defer to Doug if I'm not sure if there's anything that's really going to be about a land bank in your urban renewal area, but Doug's leaned forward.
No, there's not anything in the urban renewal plan about land banking. The urban renewal plan is about providing public infrastructure, transportation, sewer, water, stormwater improvements, such that if developer X wanted to build some affordable housing, then we could work with them about providing the public infrastructure
Yeah.
to that particular development, which reduces their cost, which then helps the affordability side of the equation for the tenants that are living in the project.
And that's the way urban renewal typically works. Sometimes it's used also for affordable housing. But on the general obligation bond, I mean, that's not going to be an easy thing to do. It's going to be difficult. The city should, and I would assume would, identify particular projects that would be funded through general obligation bond. But I'm not sure the city would go down to saying, we're going to buy this piece of land here with that, because that would probably be a poor strategic choice for the city. With the owner saying, oh, that piece of land was $100,000, now it's $1 million. So we'll leave the geo bond for now. Unless I hear something different, I'm going to assume we should keep the land banking strategy in here. Okay. All right, so then let's step down to the next one. System development, reduce system development charges for income restricted affordable housing. So this is specifically looking at housing that's affordable below 60% of median family income. The city could adopt an SDC program or change its SDC methodology to reduce or, if it chose to, eliminate system development charges for transportation, water, sewer, stormwater, any of those. When you don't charge system development charges, it's not like you aren't what do you call it? You aren't having the impact of that development on your systems. So we'll just use water systems or wastewater. You still have to have that water processed. You have to still have that, water treated in your sewage treatment plant. So that has impacts, but now it has less money. And you could do a couple of different things here. You could change your SDC methodology to address this. You could also backfill reducing SDCs for income restricted affordable housing through your CET. And I'm not sure where that part of the discussion on either of those has been going, either Doug or Mary.
We're headed that way. I mean, we're trying to put together we now have the pot of money that's been developing over the last couple of years, and we're now putting together, how we're going to use it. But that is certainly one of the things we've talked about.
Yeah, so when we went to the city council on the program and had a series of meetings with them, backfilling SDCs using CET money, we love acronyms in this world,
Indeed.
was on the table. And so it's now up to the Affordable Housing Commission to review that program and make some recommendations to the city council if that's what they specifically want to do.
And have you guys had any discussion about when you next examine your SDC methodology, choosing not to charge SDCs or lowering them for income restricted housing development?
So the city will be initiating some discussions about SDCs starting next month.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been on the table for a couple of years now. And some of the past conversations have been, could we lower the SDC costs for affordable housing? Could we waive the SDC costs for affordable housing? Could we defer SDC payments for some period of time to let a particular project stabilize and then pay back SDCs over time? I'm not sure if all of those are going to be part of this conversation on SDCs or if it'll be more focused just on the methodology, the math and the methodology, because there are different ways to calculate SDCs. But more to come on that in the coming months.
When do you think there might be something that could be talked about publicly and might end up in this document? If the answer is, not until sometime in 2023, we can leave this more open.
Right now, I think I would leave it open. I'm not sure what the exact timeline is going to look like from that committee work on the SDCs.
Okay, all right. Joyce, you look confused.
No, I'm not confused. My question is, my question is, how do we know that we're not just, that we're actually helping the project pencil out versus just getting more profit for the developer? Like what is that mechanism?
This is your affordable low income, income restricted affordable housing. There is no profit for the developer in this.
Oh,
This is nonprofit development. They are usually putting together funding streams from 15 or 20 different places. And so they're just scraping it together.
okay. Because in Portland, you can get SDC fees waived if you're private. So I didn't know that. Thank you.
And I don't think we're talking about that here. At least I haven't heard that we're talking about that here. Because you could be talking about that.
Nope, we're not. Thank you.
Okay. So this one also seems like a keeper. Is there anything anybody wants to ask or add to this? I think we might be able to get into more details in this, maybe later in the fall or in the final document. So, okay. All right, then I wanted to go to reducing permit fees for affordable housing. And I would say this is probably, we could be more specific about this and call this income restricted affordable housing, which is what I think this is about. But Doug, can you talk about what your permit fees, such as your land use fees, your public improvement fees, your building permit fees, what do they fund in the city?
So it comes in two various parts. There's always more than one. So land use fees go into the general fund to pay for general fund services, which includes community development department, the planning division functions. We have public improvement permit fees. That's for all of that public infrastructure and to do the plan reviews. The revenue for that goes into the engineering funds or public work funds, again, to help pay for staff who's doing that particular work. Then we have the building permit fees. And building permit fees are an enterprise fund. So building revenues can only be used for building division functions. So we do plan reviews, and of course we issue the permits and track all of that. And so that revenue goes to pay for the building division staff to do those types of review processes. Those are the primary ones. So, in the parlance, if you were looking at reducing fees, then that has a direct correlation to revenue that comes into the general fund to provide general fund services. I should also note that we do have a fee that's called the community development fee. And that's 0.75% of the permit value. And that revenue goes into the general fund to pay for general fund services as well, which includes community development. So those are our revenue functions. So reduction in any of the revenue of those, then it correlates back to reduced general fund revenues. So then you have priorities of what general fund services are you providing. So general fund services are generally library, community development planning division, police department, which is the largest cost of general fund expenses that occur within the city. So those are your kind of three primary expenditure locations. All the other funds we have in different departments, there are interfund transfers that occur. So like my planning division, we do interfund transfers back to it's called Fund 31, which is for our administrative services, city manager, finance, legal department, and so forth. So it's a complicated mathematical model, but those are the general consequences if you reduce.
Okay. And so it seems to me, obviously the city should be careful about making this choice, just like making the choice around system development charge changes. But this might be something the city wants to do specifically for income restricted affordable housing development. And it might be something that city chooses to do. Do you think this would be something the city could do on a case-by-case basis, Doug? Or do you have concerns about equity in making choices, that kind of thing?
I think we would have to be cautious about that. Different projects. I mean, you have to have a process with some criteria in place that can be evaluated based on a particular project that likely, it might be the Affordable Housing Commission reviews it, makes a recommendation to the city council. City council ends up making a final decision. Currently, and this kind of goes back to the SDC, currently we allow on a calendar year the waiver of SDCs for water and wastewater for 2 affordable housing units a year.
2 affordable units.
Yep.
Okay, which is very different than a new multifamily structure, which could have, say 30 units in the structure.
Correct. And that program was modeled into our SDCs methodology that we're currently using, that we adopted in 2016.
And just,
So,
and
go ahead.
most of those have gone to Habitat in the last few years, I would say.
They've been the only ones who've requested it.
Correct.
So this is going to be small and it's going to not happen very often. I'm not sure. What do you guys think about keeping this in?
Is
for
this,
now at least?
I guess, is this something still that, just like with SDCs, that construction excise tax could also backfill if needed?
It could. That was also talked about when we were putting together the CET proposal and adopted the ordinances. CET could help pay for permit fees, be they land use, building, or public improvements. Fees, just the fee portions.
My concern about this one, is there a business case that says we have gotten to some efficiencies where those fees, we are allowed to transfer the savings on, I don't see that driving it at the moment, that we had savings we could pass on. The other thing I was just also concerned about is in the permitting process, are there levels of technical assistance or prepping development teams that would get missed if we had fee waivers. So I'm just kind of concerned about that, like stuff that happens on the back end as we move people through the permitting process. And, you know, not that I want to see permitting processes be inefficient, but if that, if we have the structure right now that they're not inefficient and people are moving through and not complaining, this would be one of the places I would not want to reduce at this time.
So what generally, you know, the two primary sources other than fees that are collected for general fund revenue are property taxes and franchise fees.
And Doug, explain what a franchise fee is.
A franchise fee, so utility companies such as, you know, telecommunications, phone providers, natural gas, electricity, when they are using public right-of-ways for cities, we can charge a franchise fee. I'm going to use that term loosely because there's some different nomenclature to be able to use our public rights of way for their infrastructure. And they get charged on an annual basis. And each contract is different that we have, or franchise agreement that we have with those utility companies.
And Doug, I'm going to ask a question. I don't want to go down a big rabbit hole, and this is not an argumentative question at all. I don't want you to take it that way. But let's say an organization like a school district had a big bond and paid $1 million, close to $1 million in building permit fees. But if those are restricted to only go to the building department, does I mean, they're not hiring that many more people to cover those kind of things, I assume. Does that just carry over for a long time? You know, how does that work?
It carries over. So, you know, I always try to work on a 5-year financial plan, looking at the ups and downs in the economy, because we've all been through recessions. I've been through a number of them in my career, where you may be stable 1 year and 4 years from now, you're in a recession. There's no development that's coming in, or development levels are reduced. And so then you use your contingencies to help buffer that reduction that may last for several years before development picks up again. So it's a biorhythm, it's an ebb and flow. So building fund is Fund 8, which is our building fund, is one of those. You know, I'll give you an example. When I came to the city, the building fund only had $25,000 in contingency. They basically, during a recession, they spent it all down. And we have diligently worked hard to build up that contingency so that we have some reserve. So when the next recessionary measure hits us, we've got some buffer to move through that for however long that period may be, year, 2 years, 2.5, what, all hypothetical, how long they would last. But we also, with the building fund, is that we look at what we need for staffing levels, both in-house or that we contract out to provide services. So those revenues also do that. And over my time here, I've done both. We've hired outside consultants to help us with the volume. This particular year, we budgeted for some additional staffing if the economy stays healthy.
Thank you.
So this
I stayed out of the rabbit hole there. Yeah, stayed out of the rabbit hole.
So
So
as far
this
as
one-
keeping or getting rid of, that's what we're trying to decide,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's kind of what I was going towards.
Yeah, I think if we're looking to cut the fat anywhere and cut down on especially the administrative and things of that nature without losing too much of the incentives, that the permits would be the one to throw out. I think that the multiple unit property tax and the SDCs are going to be much more helpful in gaining and maintaining income-based properties.
Any disagreement with that?
I don't actually disagree. I think it might be even safer in our like it allows us to just maybe be more equitable if we're not going to have discussions about whose permits, who doesn't have to pay a permit fee and who does. It's a little bit more distance we have, a little less charged, I feel like.
Yeah, my only hesitation in throwing it out is, we have not yet determined what exactly we're going to do with our construction excise tax money. And, if we, again, I could see us doing both, in certain projects, backfilling SDCs and permit fees, because we feel like it's a very valuable project, we really want to see it happen. So
But we also have the applications and stuff that are going to be happening for things like grant money and things of that nature. So any of these developers or anybody that wants to suddenly, upgrade and they need permits, still have the opportunity to apply for those funds through other ways than just having a constant influx of decision making that we have to have if we do it through the reduced permit.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not super strong. I just don't want to shut off any avenues that we haven't had those discussions yet on the Affordable Housing Commission side of, what resources we might want to have available to people. That's the only thing.
So why don't we put this as a maybe? And we're going to be having some more discussions, including with affordable housing developers. So I think, asking them what's going to be really important to them, and asking them to prioritize different strategies that may well shed some light onto this. So let's go talk about multi-unit property tax exemption. That's completely different. That's in the housing that's affordable up to 120%, but a lot of cities cap it around 80% of what do you call it? Multifamily. 80% of income that's income that's affordable to a household making 80% of multifamily income.
Yeah,
That's
I
a
definitely
very
think
first
that's a
thing.
wise decision to make on that one. So, but I couldn't see giving property tax exemptions to apartments that are charging, $1,600 a month rent.
Mhm.
Like the 120% just seems crazy to me to give any kind of tax exemption for. But up to 80, I could see being viable to help in all the areas we're really trying to focus on and help in.
If this is something we want to keep on the table, what we might do is do a little more analysis about this specific one. I can bring into discussions with Mary and Doug, one of my colleagues, Becky Hewitt, who does a lot of work around using this particular tax exemption and has been helping cities decide whether to consider adopting it or not.
Can I ask just,
Sure.
do majority, and maybe this is a dumb question because that's probably why they're developing these, but do a majority of these kind of buildings or whatever that are built stay, continue to be owned by that person and they make the money off them in the future? Are they building them and selling them to somebody else?
It varies. It really varies. The property tax exemption is given for a 10-year period. And so any affordability requirements probably disappear after that 10-year period. So what the city does is if it's going to adopt a MUPD, it identifies an area where it wants the MUPD to apply. So in Eugene, for instance, it's in the downtown and the corridor out towards the university. It decides the situation, the criteria for qualifying for the MUPD. So in Eugene, and I think I've heard Ben just adopted this also, not only do you need to have at least some units that are affordable at 80% or below, you also need to have a pro forma that shows that your development wouldn't pencil out if it were not for that tax exemption. And I think that I know the staff at Eugene who review the pro forma. They used to work here, so I'm confident that that staff person can smell out a bad pro forma. But I think Bend may be hiring some consultants who do a lot of pro forma work to evaluate the pro forma to make sure that it's not just garbage in, garbage out, because you can play games with numbers. And so there's lots of different ways you can look at the tax exemption and set different standards for it. And then it's something that the city can grant or not. If you have the program, a developer applies for it. It only applies to multifamily buildings of 5 or more units. Then the city can decide it wants to grant it, it doesn't want to grant it. Maybe the city wants to grant it for 7 years, not 10 years. I'm not sure why that would be, but the city has a fair bit of discretion in use of this particular property tax exemption.
And
The
Doug,
other
don't we do
part-
some of this right now?
I'm sorry.
No, we don't, Larry. When I was in Salem, we had the MUPTI program that was in the downtown area. So I did a project there. There's also a coordination that has to occur with the other taxing districts.
Right.
Yes. So does it
um,
only apply to the city's part of the property tax,
Oh.
or does it apply to all of them?
All- or some combination.
Can I ask
and- Go ahead.
All right, so actually that's my question is, in some cases, if a nonprofit, right, is on your project at a certain level of control or ownership, you already get a tax exemption in some places, or not. In this situation, the city of Newberg is not looking at the nonprofit interest or control on a project and automatically granting an exemption.
That's not really how it works here. There's the nonprofit corporate tax exemption, which, if I'm remembering correctly, the city plans to just adopt. So we chopped it out of what we were doing. Am I remembering that right, Mary?
We already have that one on the books.
Okay, you already have it on the books. So then if you're a nonprofit and you're not the housing authority, for instance, so you're not automatically exempted from property tax, you apply for that property tax exemption, and if you qualify, then you get it.
And then there's annual reporting and review that has to occur. And if you do not file your report, your tax exemption goes away.
But
nice thing about
haven't we, I mean, I'm Doug, I'm sorry, haven't we though talked about the, like, if they build up, if there's commercial on the first floor and then there's
Yeah, so
affordable
we did-
housing above, or some of those kind of things, haven't we talked about?
Yeah, we did a different program. We did the vertical housing development zone,
Right,
which
right,
is in the downtown area. So
right.
that's a partial tax abatement for floors 1 through 4, I believe it
Right.
is, above commercial. So you're still paying the full taxes on the commercial,
Right.
you're still paying it on the land. If you're providing affordable units as well, at 80% of less of AMI, then you can also get some reduction in your land value on your property taxes. So yes, we have that program on the books, but only for the downtown area.
Right. Okay. That's what I was thinking of. And I know it's probably a little different than this, but seems similar at least. So.
It's a lot different. The vertical housing tax exemption, we don't really talk about it in the context of affordable housing, because it's not about getting housing that's more affordable in a lot of ways. It's about getting mixed use. And mixed use development is typically more expensive to do because you have to develop to commercial standards on the ground floor. So, Joyce, you've got a question?
One more quick question. It says it's about the housing and not the land. So then this can be used for scattered site developments.
I don't know what a scattered site development is.
So like in tax credit world, you can have multiple buildings all on the same project.
If it was all on one site,
One
you
bin,
could-
yeah,
you-
one identification number.
you could have 3 buildings as a project on one site, and the MUPTI would be a potential program for property tax exemption on that project, or that project could all be in one building, but it's all on one site.
Okay. So then those are the ones that I was most concerned about. What else do you guys want to talk about here? We've got about 40 minutes left. I can take us up to wherever you'd like to go.
I have a different question that, again, maybe this is completely the wrong place to talk about this, but does the development of workforce housing, is that related to any of this here?
That's where I was going to go. You know, I try not to use the word workforce housing, Larry, because
Okay.
workforce housing is used, it's kind of pejorative, and it generally applies to housing affordable at like 80% of median family income. But your households that have low income are often part of your workforce. So the first strategy, support development of market rate affordable housing. That means to say it's workforce housing. So it's housing that's affordable above 60% of median family income, somewhere below 120% of it, because we're talking about rental housing here. And so we need to have some discussion with people from the Newberg Workforce Housing Consortium to figure out some of what they're doing and what their thoughts are. But I imagine that this action is going to unfold more through that discussion. And Doug, I'm forgetting her name from SEDCOR, who is so great and so helpful.
Abisha
Her name begins
Stone.
with A. Abisha, thank you.
Abisha Stone.
I think Abisha is the person I believe that Doug was thinking we would talk to about this. So yeah. And then generally speaking, things like MUPD tie into to that kind of housing. And then the thing we haven't talked about was looking at density bonus to support development of affordable housing. The density bonus could apply to income restricted affordable housing. It could apply to market rate affordable housing. It's not necessarily something that I don't have a strong opinion about it being specified what kind of housing it is. This would be something, again, that the city would develop policies around. So it basically says that the city under certain conditions will allow the developer to build at densities higher than are usually allowed by the underlying zone.
Haven't
So
these latest changes in the zoning to be able to do, in R1 and R2, to be able to put duplexes and triplexes and all those kind of things, and hasn't that kind of addressed that to a large extent?
no, that's about middle housing types. We're talking about multifamily housing types.
Right.
So what if somebody wanted to build, I hope I don't shock anybody by saying a 7-story building. And I don't know if that's allowed in Newberg or not, but let's say it's not allowed in Newberg. Maybe you can only build a 5-story building. You could have a density bonus that allowed development of that type. So maybe it's taller, maybe it's just more dwelling units per acre. One thing to realize is that under Senate Bill 8, which was passed, I can't remember if it was the last legislative session or the one before that, that automatically grants affordable housing developers, the income restricted affordable housing developers, a density bonus in any city. And the particulars of it, I think, vary by the zone, but it lets you develop a lot taller and a lot more dense. And I suspect it's going to cause some issues for some communities. I know that Hood River is trying to discourage the use of it by proposing other changes to their zoning code so that affordable developers will stick with those other changes rather than using the provisions in Senate Bill 8.
That was kind of my question about density bonus, was how do we protect the quality of life, the transportation, the livability in those areas for people who probably already have less option to purchase amenities that we're about to say you can kind of go without. So are there provisions for the infrastructure for that density bonus?
You can choose
Like the
to grant
walkability.
it. Maybe you want to grant it in your urban renewal district. You're already going to be putting investment into your infrastructure there. Maybe there's some better place to grant it. Doug has this thing unmuted, so you may want to answer.
That's one particular option. I mean, I don't think it's not the goal today, to get down to the nitty gritty about all the land use changes that we would have to make to accommodate it. But we do have a 540 acre urban renewal district in place now. So could you provide some additional density bonuses within that? Yes. We've got land that is in goal 5 protected areas, riparian areas. And, we would like to be able to shift some of the density that can't be built, up to the developable portion of the site. That means we have to step back and look at our parking regulations, our landscape regulations, our open space regulations, and all of that to accommodate it. But we need to start someplace. Is this something that this citizens committee would have on the list as an action? And then it would be staff following up with what do we need to all evaluate and what might we need to change in the code to be able to accommodate it.
I think
So
that
the
between
quality-
the,
Good.
I think that between all of the things we just went through, between the fact that we now in downtown can build above commercial if we want, the fact that the middle income housing has been addressed by the state already, and then apparently, I didn't know this, that apparently the whole state now has this bonus already in place for the low income stuff. I don't think it's really an action we need on here then, with already so much overlapping coverage of things that could help in this. I don't see us allowing some business to come in and make 5-story apartments that are at 80% really being something that we should focus on or have an action for.
So I don't know if staff has other thoughts about this. They know their zoning code much more than I do.
As always, I'll jump in. So think of it this way. And we were talking about the urban renewal district, which has a mix of zones within that district. So in the downtown area, there is no height limit restriction. It's governed by conical surfaces from the airport about how tall you can build a building. If you were in a high density residential zone within that urban renewal district, which we have land that is in that category, we're limited to 35 feet in height. So you take half the distance between the ridge and half the distance and the eave line, and that's the height of your building. So basically a 3-story walk up.
That's pretty short.
Same thing for our R2. So one of the things staff would have to look at is say, well, if you're allowing density bonuses, might we look at it and say, well, does it apply to the commercial? Does it apply to the R3, whereby you can increase the height of the structure to maybe get an additional floor? That's the bonus. You get, you can go now up to 45 feet or 50 feet for your structure height. Again, those are a lot of just, planners details, looking at the code about what those particular options are. We also have situations where we've got high density residential land that has been designated since 1979 that is never developed to high density. What are the incentives to be able to do that? So another program, urban growth boundary expansion, Beth is aware of this, we have to look at efficiency measures within our existing land supply to accommodate the population in the future. So is a density bonus one potential way to address this issue for a housing production strategy, but also fits into another program issue that the city is working on.
I'll add
So
2 other things.
please, Mary.
One being, in a city I worked for before, we had density bonus in certain zones, and it was for, you could add another story. 3 was the cap stories. You could add another if you were doing a green building, meeting certain standards, making it energy efficient, and then another story if you were doing income restricted affordable housing. So it's usually you're trying to incentivize certain things with the density bonus. I will also say money for income restricted affordable housing is so tight that the more units you can get, the more likely you will get the money. So for example, this was for a senior income restricted affordable housing project. They needed the 5 stores or else they would not have been competitive enough to get funding. So there's that too.
And so you can look at this as essentially a way to balance out the financial feasibility. Does that additional story get you more financial feasibility? And you know, if you can't make your developer, let's say you're a market rate developer, if you can't make it pencil out, you're not going to build it. So if an additional story makes it pencil out, you know, and let's not assume necessarily a greedy developer, because many of them aren't, then in certain circumstances, it might well be appropriate to do that in certain areas.
My other question about that is then how do we make sure people still build those 2-3 bedroom units for families and don't just like use that extra floor to put in all studios again? Like, how do we?
There's usually in the money you get, they're wanting to incentivize 2 to 3 story apartments. Usually, I think that's the general direction they're going for. They'll want to see a mix of apartment types if you want to be competitive.
2 to 3 bedroom apartments.
Yeah.
And so maybe we should, you know, target this specifically instead of at that middle income housing. Maybe this should be targeted more at income restricted housing. Okay. All right, you guys are helping here, believe it or not. You should believe it though. So how about we go to preservation of manufactured home parks? This is a hard one. This is one where you're not seeing, I haven't seen any manufactured home parks built in Oregon since I've been doing this kind of work for 17 years. Somebody else might have seen some built. Maybe we'll see some built with new manufacturing capabilities. In other words, new innovative housing types. But this is really about supporting preservation of manufactured home parks. And let's first assume that the city doesn't necessarily have a lot of financial finances to offer to this. So this is really the city is acting as a partner and a supporter in this strategy. So I don't know. How do you guys feel about this one being an important one to include? We could include this. I think we're going to have some, you know, other recommendations that aren't necessarily strategies. We could include this as an other recommendation where the city should partner and support this.
I guess I wonder, again, probably the city isn't going to be the funder. I know a good friend who I think works for CASA. I mean, I know there's lots of different CASAs, but the one that actually helps throughout the state, helps people that live in manufactured home parks kind of buy them and own them themselves. What I wonder is if there's ways to put some, it's almost like right of first refusal or something. If somebody's wants to develop their property that's currently a manufactured home, that they have to at least first entertain offers from the people that live there or something like that. I don't know if you can do that or not, but
I worry about that for the people who are living there. I could see it more for the park itself. But would that be a burden for the people who are living there? In other words, are the people living in the manufactured home park marginal enough that would cause them problems? Is what I'm really asking.
And again, I don't know a lot about this specifically, but But it seems like the problem more often is that the person who owns it just has an idea of what they can do to make more money off their property. Get rid of the mobile homes and build apartments, do whatever, sell it for something else, develop it. And once they're down that road and figured out what they want, then it's almost too late in there, to get them to even consider if there is funding or if there are ways to help support the people that live there to be able to. I mean, again, I'm not talking about the people like have to come up with the money, but again, I think there are organizations that would help with that part if the person owning the property had to at least consider that before they could just sell and kick everybody out or whatever.
So you're talking about the park owner there.
Right.
I'm in agreement with you. There's a lot of legal requirements around selling a manufactured home park. You can't just wake up one day and say, I'm selling my manufactured home park. There's a whole lot of things that the owner has to do, including give quite a lot of time of notice. Joyce, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, my concern about if we don't preserve, like we don't make a strong effort to preserve is a lot of the family composition in these manufactured homes are a lot larger and more extended families and could probably get into the kinds of apartments and housing we're talking about building. So if we don't, I don't know where in the system a lot of those extended families can fit. I don't know that we're even building houses to make room for that level of extended families or multiple migrant workers living in the same home. So I would feel like it should be pretty big on our list to preserve those spaces as available at this time, since we don't have another solution. Because when we lose a family there, we might be losing like 2 to 3 families in one home.
Or the flip side is they're retired people on a very, very limited income. And, if the rental space price goes up very much, they're no longer going to be able to afford it. The city is doing some things to help keep them in affordable housing, as far as providing some grants and loans and other things to help renovate units, both newer units, but then also some money put towards older units so that they still are viable for people to live in. So that has been something that we've done for the last few years anyway.
My only concern is this is a pretty weak position for the city. The city's not in a position to do much more than look for partnerships and look to be part of the discussion, other than the existing CDBG funds it spends on grants.
Is this a place we could land bank?
You've already got housing there. So.
Oh, I get it. It can't be. Oh, see, that's why I was talking about the trust, because you can do non-cash assets, not just land. Okay.
But couldn't you, if you bought if people are just renters, if they don't own it and the park owner could not, either the city or a public entity or a nonprofit or whatever, buy that and basically say it's now in this land trust for however long, and so we're never going, we're only going to keep the rate at certain levels or that kind of thing.
Well, it puts the city in the position of being a landlord.
I know. It's not something the city would do. And like I say, I guess that's what's hard is I think this is a really important one, but I'm not sure how many tools the city has, or strong tools the city has, to actually make it happen.
I just wanted to add, I think it's a really important part of our population. I think it's a lot of our work. I mean, I think it's a really important part of our population to service. And
no, you can't replace this housing, literally. So maybe this is one that we think about a little bit more, and I don't know, even if we don't come up with a good solution out of the HPS, in other words, we haven't been smart enough. Maybe in addition to the partnerships, it's the city looking for other ways to support this, because maybe something will change in the future. This is a problem for cities across the state. All right. So do we want to talk about things like establishing a maximum lot size? Matt,
The one thing out of all of these, like, 20 different actions or whatever, that I know the community is horribly anxious about and nobody wants to approach, but that we need to talk about, is the city's support of access to emergency shelter.
okay, let's talk about that one.
I've been dealing a lot online with the community pages. I run one of the Facebook Newberg community pages. I've put up polls, have discussed with people, have tried to, dissuade things of disinformation and such about it. But there is a very strong feeling in the community about trying to basically just get rid of all emergency shelter access. And I think unless the city steps up and puts something on the books saying, hey, this is what we're going to allow exactly, this is what we're going to allow as far as funding and stuff, that somebody else is going to come along and, make problems and do it for the city.
So what we've got here is providing information, working with other organizations to make sure that emergency shelter is available. Is there any reasonable chance, Doug, that in some way emergency shelters would be made not allowed in Newberg? You're muted, I'm sorry.
Most people like that when I'm muted. It has not been a topic that has come up in front of city council, and they haven't provided us any direction. I think the coordination work that we've done with Beth and Leanne at this point in time it's really about working with partners. I'm not sure that the city is going to operate a shelter, but it's working with partners, nonprofit organizations who have the capacity, the wherewithal, and the desire to operate an emergency shelter.
Well, and we do have a shelter in Newberg.
Yes.
There's actually two different. There's one for families or individuals, and there's one for women with some different kinds of, and then and that's not including then some churches that have will open when it's certain times a year or whatever as well. So it's not that the city runs them or owns them, but there are some resources. It's not, I won't say there's enough, but there are some resources here.
Joyce, what was your comment?
Yeah, so just like they said, those partnerships. And so my question is, do we have the thing that allows them to use the emergency and transitional, basically that law that this is an emergency shelter, a transitional shelter, so they can go ahead and the partners can do their pop-up shelters on their private property, right? So we either have to strengthen that, put out that says that it is a state of emergency, so they can do those 90-day shelters on their properties without interference. That's kind of like what I've been talking to with the Church of Christ about how we do pop-ups in their parking lot, and we've done it in other locations and used that status. But the two things have to be identified: one, that it was temporary in nature, they were running it, and that somebody at the city identified the state of emergency of housing, of shelter not being available, right? That allowed the basically temporary status of the nonprofit to be warranted. And I think with those mechanisms in place, with the state of emergency being stated and they're going to keep it under their 90 days, it seems like the partnerships could be specifically strengthened. And then our piece, of course, is shelter bed transparency. That if somebody comes into the waiting list system, that we know where, we know how that is, and if people are getting in or out. My understanding is right now it's kind of like get a ticket to McMinnville if you need a shelter. I think that was like kind of one of the ways we deal with it if they don't have room here in Newberg. And so the other piece can be a transportation plan. When shelter bed transparency says even we don't have a spot, it is just like that ticket to the next shelter. And I know other cities do that, like send people out for special needs housing.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is we need something on the books that solidifies the availability to do that. The problem is everybody's trying to fight over the fact of whether a church has the right to act like a church right now. Like they're arguing about, hey, we don't want them to have people able to come seek sanctuary in their car that they're already sleeping in out on the street somewhere. We just want to give them a safe place in our parking lot to do so. And there's people arguing about whether or not they have the right to do that. And I think that the city really needs to get something on the book saying that, yeah, you know, nonprofits have the right to host emergency shelters.
Doug, you're more familiar with what the city allows now and doesn't allow. And maybe
So-
we need to take this up after.
I think we need to take it up after. There's a lot of community conversation going on. And I think one of the things is defining what is an emergency shelter. Often everything gets thrown in a broad net. And are we talking about just a fine thread about emergency shelter? So I think maybe we need to come up with a definition, Beth, first, then
Okay.
have this conversation.
Okay. Other people who want to bring up particular things they want to make sure we talk about? We've got about 15 minutes left. We haven't talked about short-term rentals, if anybody's really wants to talk about that.
I think short-term rentals is a dangerous conversation because you don't want to take away, you know, people making money, but at the same time you want the housing. So I landed at a loss on that one when I was reading through everything, because while I may not like the idea that some developer is making a bunch of money that doesn't even live here off of, you know, people coming into wine country and staying for the week, at the same time, anybody that has like an ADU that they're doing to make money for their household, I don't want to restrict them. So
Well, some cities have said you can't do short-term rentals in ADUs. So there's a lot of different ways that you can, that a city can restrict if it chooses to short-term rentals.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, in fact, somebody was talking about this the other day in a group I was in, that the percentage is fairly low right now. And I don't know if Doug, if you would agree with that, the kind of the amount of those that are used for short-term rentals, Airbnb, whatever kind of a thing. Because I know some communities have at least restricted the kind of the number or the percentage or something like that. You know, you can only have up to this level. I am not opposed to something like that, depending on what that level is. I mean, I have friends who have Airbnbs, you know, and that's something they do for part of their income. I also am concerned about enough affordable housing units for people around. So not sure what the answer is.
Newberg currently has about 41 short-term rentals that are known. The city defines short-term rentals as either bed and breakfast type of establishments where they're renting 2 or fewer rooms or 3 or more rooms, and then actual vacation rentals. I think the difference here is that part of the unit is being rented versus the full unit, and Mary's nodding at me.
Yes.
So the city If it's concerned, if the main concern is about safety and code compliance, could consider inspections, but that's not what I'm hearing here. There's a variety of restrictions that cities have used, if that's something that the city does. So, you know, set a maximum % of units or tax lots that can be used as short-term rentals. Limit the number citywide or per neighborhood. I don't know how much this is something that we think is currently an issue in Newberg. I feel like this is something we heard from some of the decision makers, Doug. But I could be conflating my projects.
No, so Mary and I went and had a conversation several months ago about short-term rentals with city council. And the guidance and direction they provided us was to go do some additional research. Mary provided Beth and Leanne the number of what we had. You know, when you take that as, and we only allow short-term rentals in single-family homes. So, you know, 41 out of, and I don't have the number off the top of my head, single-family homes we have, it's a small percentage. But what we do have is a congregation of those units immediately north and south of downtown. So what we're hearing is issues about changing neighborhood character with these particular types of units. We've also heard about it's taking away long-term rental capacity because it's moved into short-term rental, which gets to Matt's question about, or comment about, a property owner being able to make income off of their property. There's no clear direction, but that it's on our list for this project to have a discussion. Because in the end, these are all our policy choices.
So maybe the more interesting piece might well be some limit per neighborhood.
I
Joyce?
have a question about this. So then how do we get revenue off of, I mean, are they paying any business taxes, and what's our revenue piece there? And is there a way then to have people pivot with how we are responding to the revenue generation?
So it comes in different ways. So if you have a single family home in the R1 and R2, it requires a conditional use permit. So there's an application and it has to go to the planning commission for a public hearing. If you're in the R3 and you have a detached single family home, it's an outright permitted use, but we have standards that you have to comply. So again, there's a land use application associated with it. If you have a short-term rental, you have to have a business license. So it costs you $50 a year for a business license. And using your short-term rental, you have to pay a transient lodging tax. So that's 9%. And they have to pay their tax on a quarterly basis to the city. The TLT revenue is then split by 65% going to the city's general fund, 35% going to tourism-related activities.
It's a nice split.
So we could raise the transient lodging tax potentially, or not we, but if people wanted to address that, what would it take to lift that tax rate?
City
But
council
does that
would have
apply to
to.
hotels
Council.
and stuff too?
Do you
Sorry,
have
also
hotels in Newberg?
sorry.
So TLT applies to hotel and short-term rentals. So anything that's 30 days or less in a stay. So to raise the transient lodging tax would require the city council making that determination. We went from 5% to 6% to 7%. We're currently at 9%.
And when you raise the TLT these days, you can't do the same split that you've got currently.
That's
in terms
right.
of
It's
use.
just the opposite. So anything new for the increase. So we have a blended rate because we had a program pre-state law that changed the methodology. So any increase in the TLT is just the opposite. 70% of that 1% increase, based upon Joyce's comment, would go to the tourism related activities, Taste Newberg, visitor center functions, and only 30% would go to the general fund.
The other thing I would just throw in, Beth, you're talking about the neighborhood and Doug had mentioned, concentration. The other, I guess the flip side is isn't that where people want, you know, they can be within walking distance of going to the coffee shop, going to a place to eat, going to, you know, shopping or whatever in the downtown. Yeah, people are there for the wine industry or whatever in the general area, but also that they can, you know, get to things that are close by. So
They're also generally going to have a car.
yeah, no, it's true.
At
It's
Newberg
true.
without a car.
Yep.
Can I jump in
yeah.
and just say that, you know, being a student at George Fox, all those short-term rentals downtown that aren't available for student housing do hurt. They hurt, they're hurting the student population. That it
Yeah.
is coming out of our what's available to us to walk to school.
Yep. Yeah,
So
I would
my,
also,
Go ahead.
oh, I would just say, I'd also add, there's really this like, important distinction between the bed and breakfast and vacation rental. Vacation rental is the entire home is being rented out, and the bed and breakfast is typically the person is still living there and renting out rooms while continuing to live there.
Right.
So a lot of times the bed and breakfast is usually more for somebody to help them, you know, pay their mortgage or that sort of thing, whereas the vacation rental tends to be a second home and they're renting it out that way.
So how do you think that when you start getting more duplexes and quadplexes and that kind of thing will play into this? Currently, it sounds like they're only allowed in single family detached units.
The council hasn't given us any direction, so right now we're sticking with the detached single family home. So duplex, triplex, and so forth would not be allowed to be used as a short-term rental,
But new cottage units could be.
but new cottage units could
And
be.
ADUs could be.
Yes.
So, and you might, honestly, you might think about not allowing some of those new housing types, especially your ADUs as short-term rentals. Those are the types that may be more affordable to, say, your students or your older folk with cottage housing, that kind of thing. So.
Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention too is I think all of the short-term rentals that we know of are vacation rentals.
Nobody's doing the bed and breakfast thing.
We had one bed and breakfast and it's closed.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times we did have somebody interested in doing that, but the conditional use fee was too high for them to do that. Whereas the vacation rental, it's still the same fee, but doesn't seem to be as big of a issue.
okay, now, okay, help me with this again. So, because I know some friends who have an ADU that they use as a Airbnb. They, you know, it's, so what is the difference, I guess? Back to, I mean, I thought from the
An ADU is a detached single family home. It's an accessory dwelling unit to the primary unit. So the way our regulations are now is that you could use an ADU as a short-term rental.
right,
And we have people doing that.
right. I mean, that's
So what-
these friends of mine are doing that, and I'm pretty sure they're doing it legitimately. I mean, I think they're you know, registered and everything.
So we have, you know, the city's program didn't start until 2012 on
Right.
short-term rentals. So we've got historic legacy operations that have never gone through any type of land use review, but starting in 2012, then you had to get your conditional use approval if you were an R1 or R2, or you had to get your type 1 design review approval if you were in R3.
So it sounds like city council wants to see this one stay on the list, so that they can consider the options. And I expect this action would be to evaluate, you know, whether the city wants to in some way limit short-term rentals. And the options for limiting them that we listed here are some of the commonly used options.
Yeah, and that's what I guess in a lot of ways, I feel like it isn't a problem yet, but you don't want to wait till it's a problem until you address it in some ways. So, you know, to set up some limits or something.
Yeah, I could
Now?
say like as a parent, you know, kind of don't want as many short-term rentals next to the elementary school. Yeah, I'm not trying to be like steery like that, but those are the kind of things that would influence my like support of a bunch of those.
So Hood River, when we did their housing needs analysis back in 2015, they had a growing issue with short-term rentals, and figuring out how to limit them was well, it was a 2-year fight. And I don't think the short-term rental people in Hood River will ever rent to me again. Short-term rentals are essentially banned in Hood River, except for the way you guys do it with bed and breakfasts, and their units that are grandfathered in. So. Does anybody have anything else they want to add or discuss right now? We'll be bringing you back more information. We'll be doing some interviews with different organizations. I think our next meeting is in October, and somebody who's not me perhaps could come up with the date. I think it's the 11th.
October 11th at 4 p.m.
Okay, so we'll be bringing you back more information based on some of the discussions. We might well have some strategies that we suggest cutting out, or if we've missed something that we suggest adding in. So thank you for this discussion. I think it's been helpful.
Well, thank you all. So, Mary, we're now ready to go to the Affordable Housing Commission with a caveat. We need to be done by 6:40 p.m.
Yes,
to get to the next meeting.
maybe sooner. We'll see.
How fast
That's
can
my
you
goal.
talk? Okay, take roll. Let's go.
Yeah, Matt's them in here.
I think we know who's here, so can we move on?
So we got Matt, Larry, and Joyce.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Committee, the minutes from the last meeting. If you had a chance to look at those, would entertain a motion to approve those. We didn't have a whole lot of people that, to move and to second, but.
Yeah,
somebody
I
moved
moved
it.
to approve those.
Okay. Joyce, do you want to second it?
I'll second that, Larry.
There you
Good
go.
job. Thank you. All in favor, say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed? I don't see any. So it passed 3-0. All right. Now, Mary, do you want to, jump in with, let's see, public comments? Do we have any public comments?
We had one person, Beatrice, from before.
Right.
And-
Beatrice, did you want to make any comment for the commission? Harry, yep, okay, raising a hand there. Go ahead, Beatrice, if you want.
You're muted, Beatrice.
Yeah.
I don't know if Faye might need to let them be able to unmute themselves.
I don't know. She was able to speak before, so I don't know if that.
Faye, you out there?
I am, and I asked her to unmute. And I don't know why. There we go. Let's try this.
Well, I'm going to step aside for a moment and let my dog out.
Oops. Oh, it almost looked like she was unmuted for a second. Well, I guess I will say, can we move ahead, and then Beatrice, if we find the ability to hear you, we would love to hear from you.
I think that's a good idea. We can just move on, and then if she unmutes, she can just, let us know, and we can go back to that.
Yep. So, notice of funding availability, application, selection criteria, draft edits. Mary.
Faye, can you let me share my screen? And I have a
Yes.
PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. All right, so I'm going to do a lot of talking to you all today, but I'll make it quick as possible. So first off, we're going to go over the draft edits to the selection criteria that we discussed in last April's meeting. So we discussed for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, the selection criteria maybe needed some edits to it based on community need and ideas that the committee had for the types of projects we want to fund through this trust fund. So I drafted edits from comments I received from you all, and actually I'm going to try and share different thing. Here we go. So the edits are here. And so there's not a ton of edits, but there are some important ones that we'll talk about. So in criteria 1 here, I added the sentence, this is just minimum threshold. So a project has to meet this no matter what. It's not scored or anything. So I added a higher priority will be given to projects that provide deeply affordable housing for households earning less than 30% of area median income. So my question for you all on this one is, does it make sense to have that as a minimum threshold? It's not really saying that they have to provide deeply affordable. It's just stating that we would have a higher priority for those that do. Or does it make more sense to have it as a scored element down here so that if a project provides income restricted housing that is going to be deeply income restricted, meaning 30% of area median income or less, that they'll get more points. So that's the main question I have for this portion.
That one,
here.
it seemed to me like, I mean, I'm happy that we say it somewhere when people are knowing, putting this together to know that's going to be considered. But if it's really going to be a priority, we need to score it, and we need to have it, you know, a point system that definitely gives that a priority.
Okay. So what could be is similarly, I think, you know, we could do something where it's, you know, we could just say this sentence, but make it a scored criteria, and it could be, you know, up to a certain number of points.
Yeah, up to a certain number of points, probably like whatever that 5, just because they may have different percentages of 30%ers in there, and we want to give them that flexibility, right, to have a couple of those spackled in there as opposed to have to do the whole thing like that, and based on whatever works for them.
Okay, that makes
sense. And
me.
the criteria, I would say, you know, the one that it wouldn't say higher priority will be given to, it just would be like the project provides deeply affordable housing or less than, so whatever, you know, that, since that's the criteria. But
Yep. Yeah, I like it. Okay. Is everyone in agreement on that?
Yep.
Okay. Then the other edits was here on 6. So again, still a minimum threshold. And then we just took out the and necessary. So the section says the proposal demonstrates that Newberg Affordable Housing Trust funds are the most appropriate funding source for the project. And the point being from the committee member was that wanting to incentivize people that maybe wouldn't have thought otherwise to do the use of Affordable Housing Trust Fund because of this language, and kind of creating more of a language that could be like, oh, well, yeah, we don't really need it, but if that's an opportunity, we could we'll look into it sort of thing.
So is this then the like a departure from, unless you have to have it, like unless you don't pencil out, don't come ask for this, right? Like it's a little bit of a departure for that to try to stimulate people to think more creatively.
Yeah, I think that
Not-
was
Yeah,
the
not
goal.
just
Yeah, go for
creatively,
it.
but more along the lines of, for instance, okay, you're gonna want to be doing good. You're already a nonprofit. You're gonna come into town. You want to build a house as somebody like Habitat or something, and you have the funding to do it already, but maybe you can make it better and, you know, provide a couple extra houses if you had the funding from the thing. Not necessarily that it's a necessary thing to do the project, but that it would still be helpful in accomplishing your goals or improving those goals.
And then the other part for me is because it's not scored. I mean, again, I want as many people to be thinking about, can we do an affordable housing project in Newberg? And, you know, whether it won't pencil out otherwise or not, I want them thinking about it and thinking, yeah, well, I could apply for this and see. Yeah. So anyway, that I was all right with that change.
Okay. Are we all in agreement that that's a good edit? Okay.
We nodded,
All right.
we put thumbs up, yes.
Okay, so the next is just additional information to the scored criteria number 10, adding that the project demonstrates alliance building that directly benefits community members in need, such as helping build household wealth. And that was just a comment from a community member that I sort of combined a couple of ideas and then added it that way. But so I don't think it's gonna, you know, hurt projects from applying by any means, but it adds clarification of please demonstrate that you're doing this and this type of thing as well. So what do y'all think about this?
I like the economic stimulation back to the beneficient. Like, I think it's really important that we say we want to see them better off than they started.
Yeah, I'm fine with it. It you know, it's not a lot of points anyway, but it's for that particular thing. But yeah, I think just acknowledging that's part of it. That's part of the consequence of doing these things is we help people build some household wealth. Yeah.
Okay. Great. And then, so 12 kind of is, again, just an additional item here is that projects will get higher points if they demonstrate engagement and contracting with, and I'll go down to the definitions because I added the definition here of what that means, which is a business that is disadvantaged, minority owned, women owned, emerging small business and or service disabled veterans business enterprises. And demonstrating that they, you know, have those connections or they contract with those types of businesses. Again, it's not going to deduct points, it'll just add additional points if they can do that. Do we want to be specific about how many points or keep it kind of loose and then the commission will just decide, okay, we'll add, you know, this
Yeah,
amount.
I think the loose is better way to do it because I mean, falling within that definition is so many things that you could say is or maybe isn't. But if we leave it loose, then the commission can just go, well, that's a really good thing that they do. Let's give them more points for that. Or maybe that's not quite what we were talking about. It leaves room for more of what we are personally thinking of in the issue.
I like the up to 10 one because you got the COVID, you know, definitions in there, and people actually can layer. Like, you could be both a minority woman who's a service disabled, but like you could be like all of the above. So I think it is important that we have it wiggle room there.
Well, and to me, you know, it's maybe the difference between, okay, you know, they have the capacity and stuff to do this. I would give them a 7 or an 8, but wow, with these things, they get a 10. Or, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
it may not be the difference between a 2 and an 8, but it, you know, it, or maybe actually, if the, you know, if they're really strong in those things. But I, you know, I would want to make sure that the first part of the statement is definitely true if I'm giving them very many points, because I don't want to fund them if they're really not, they really don't have the capacity to do it.
Right. Okay.
Good job.
Yeah. So are there any things that you're thinking about now? Like, oh, actually, I'd want that adjusted here or there. Or are we good with this? The only other edits I made was just that for now, it's updated. The median family income has increased to 106,500. So that's the median family income for 2022. Just so we have those numbers accurate. Okay.
Personally, I'm a person who, the people that have really worked on this, I hate it when people pick apart lots of little things that they've, you know, oh, well, could you maybe the, you know, so I appreciate this work. I appreciate that you've taken input and, you know, have captured those things that people found most concerning. I think it's great. But that's just me. I'm not saying everybody has to be that.
Okay. I think I'm seeing head nods, so.
Are we
So what
at a
we
point where we can actually like approve this then? Or,
Yeah, I was going to suggest to Mary, what we would need at this point is a motion and
Yep.
a motion to forward this package on to the city council, and then a second, and then you can vote.
okay, I motion to push it to the city council.
Seconded.
Oh, you're muted, Larry.
I know. Any discussion or anything before we vote? If not, all in
No.
favor, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Nope. All right. Thank you.
Okay, great. I will go back to this one then. And then we can talk about CET. All right. Okay, I'm gonna move ahead on all of these things. Okay. So this may be old to some of you and new to some of you, but I decided just to go for it and kind of go into the background just a little bit here. So the city of Newberg did adopt by ordinance a construction excise tax in December of 2020. And what that does is it gets revenues generated from a tax, which is 1% on a project building permit value. And that's both residential and commercial industrial mixed use. And the revenues from that tax are used to address affordable housing for families that earn 80% or less of median family income. So it's restricted to those types of projects. So how the funds can be used, this is all kind of dictated by state to a certain extent, especially the residential improvement funds. So 4% goes to administration costs, 50% to fund developer incentives, 15% to the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department for their home ownership programs that provide down payment assistance, and then 35% to fund developer incentives and affordable housing programs. So that just means developer incentives as part of affordable housing programs. And then for the CET funds for commercial, industrial, and mixed use, the city is going to use 100% of the net revenues for affordable housing programs that also include developer incentives. And I'll define what those mean next. So developer incentives usually include, but aren't limited to, like we talked about earlier, system development charges, land acquisition, public improvements. Those are some of the most common. And then affordable housing programs typically include nonprofits or entities that provide rent buy downs and subsidies, down payment assistance, for foreclosure prevention assistance. So they're kind of the ones that are actually creating the income restriction for the homes, or helping people pay their mortgages, or that sort of thing. So it's a wide variety of things that you can use the funds for. As I said, there are some caveats, there are some limits to how we can use it. Again, the city's made it so that's 80% or less of median family income projects. So they're only providing help for those that earn that kind of income or less. And then funded projects must also remain affordable at the 80% MFI or below for a period of 60 years. So that's another requirement that we provide for any project. So obviously an example could be funds pay for system development charges for a multifamily affordable housing projects. They go towards street frontage improvements for subsidized affordable housing project. It could fund a local organization's rental assistance program as well. So again, it's not just development, but it can also help for programs that are doing a variety of different housing work as well.
And Mary,
Any
I'm
questions?
just really pleased that you've signed on to be in charge of this for 60 years.
I'm not in charge of it for 60 years, but the title or the deed is.
Would that include, so that being the benchmarker, then if we were to say, yes, we want to provide a large amount of the percentage to the land bank that we were discussing, then that would be okay as long as the land bank was always assured to be used for the 80% or below range, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So the project funds cannot be used for any housing that will not, meet that 80% MFI or less. Any other questions? Okay. So I do have some questions for y'all. So we just went over the Affordable Housing Tax Fund kind of criteria. What we're wanting to do now is actually come up with some of those priorities and select not specific criteria, but kind of narrow down where maybe we want to focus these funds going, where we want to give more priority, more scoring even, so that when projects come in, we are scoring higher ones that we know we really want or need in Newberg. So based off of the housing needs analysis, which was recently done back in 2020, I believe. So it's recent. It mentions some areas of Newberg that we are below at meeting for housing need. Pretty obvious, it's going to be extremely and deeply affordable housing. So those are households earning 50% or less of median family income. Manufactured homes, we talked about those. Smaller housing types such as townhomes, duplexes, EDUs, cottage clusters. So that's what we call middle housing typically. And then we also are lacking in multifamily housing. So housing that provides 5 or more units on one lot. So my question for you all on this is, are there housing types here that you think we should prioritize for sure in terms of who will receive CET funds? Matt, I see your hand up.
Not so much because like we discussed, there's certain niches there that are very needed. For instance, somehow helping the manufactured homes, and definitely, of course, the extremely and deeply affordable housing. I think as far as the other two go, we could, take a backseat on the smaller housing types, because that's going to be more of a personal thing. We don't really need to be helping fund that as much. A lot of people are going to do that anyway with their ADUs and the things of that nature. But, multifamily housing covers a lot of those things we want to do anyway. So maybe the smaller housing types, just we don't focus on that, but focus on the other three.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I was maybe along the same lines. I was thinking, like projects that provide more, multiple units over projects that provide 1 or 2 units are more of a priority. If we have limited funds, let's help. If we can, let's help some big projects, actually happen.
Okay. And it doesn't mean that we say if you are doing income restricted duplexes that we won't provide funds. It just means a higher priority will be given towards, some of these other housing types. So we don't have to restrict, people from applying, but we can definitely provide some incentives or preferences for sure. Any other thoughts on this? No, okay. So now that we just went over the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, was there any kind of criteria in there that you thought would be really nice to move over as well as part of CET? I don't have it in front of you on the screen here, but and again, so we'll have another discussion after this. We'll have another one at the next Affordable Housing Commission, so we don't have to come up with like, these are the criteria I want. But if you know right now, great. You can also just email me and we can, have that prepared for next time too, as well. But if you know of something right now that you're like, yes, I also want to make sure that we add that as well, feel free to add that.
I think the big one would be that one that we discussed about definitely giving priority to the extremely low income, or like, for instance, restricted, like anybody doing where you have to make under a certain amount to rent there and it's income restricted and such. I think would definitely be good to also prioritize that in this section.
Okay.
I also wonder if this is the place to where we took out the emphasis before on it's not viable without this kind of funding, that maybe this is the place to put in that, this kind of thing is not going to happen unless they get some help with it, and so they really need the funding for it. That's a wonder for me, at least.
Can at least draft it, and
Yeah.
then we can have discussion about it.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Anything else?
I mean, some of the just basic things like, they do have the capacity to follow through and,
Right.
get it done. Some of those kind of things, obviously, I think, but
Yes. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of text on here. I apologize. It's like not what I'm supposed to do in PowerPoints, but it had to be there. So as part of this, I did some research into what other Oregon cities provide as criteria for their CET program to see if there's things that we wanted to add as part of ours. Some cities have a variety of different priorities, including saying that service should be provided to historically underserved communities and families with children. Lower incomes based on a scale, so it'd be 0 to 30%, 30 to 60, 60 to 80. And then it'd be like a scale would be more points given towards, lower income, and then, a little bit less as you go higher because there's more priority of need here. Permanent supportive housing and or transitional housing for families or individuals that are houseless was also a criteria or preference given in other cities. Acquisition of existing housing or non-residential buildings that will become affordable housing. And then projects that are close to schools, parks, commercial areas tend to be closer to amenities and services that maybe they wouldn't be able to be close to without having this project there. Are there any of these on here that you want me to look into further to add?
I think the one with the close to either transportation or services and things, because that's the one concern I've heard brought up a lot involving the Peace Village issues is people are asking why aren't they closer to the hospital? Why aren't they closer, to the bus line? Why aren't they? And I mean, they're right. Like, if we could have them closer, obviously that would be ideal. But so that I think that would be a good one to add as a priority thing. Like, hey, are you going to build this where people can really take full advantage of the different resources that we have available?
I find myself, I agree with that one, by the way. I find myself wondering about the second one, the, you know, priority to 0 to 30 and then 30. The reason why, not because I don't think, I mean, I think there's a huge need. I think it's way harder to meet the need of 0 to 30
Yeah,
and even 30 to 60 than it is 60 to 80.
true.
And in fact, I'm wondering if we're going to miss out on some great projects that could really make a dent in the 60 to 80 that are bigger projects that people could do if they, you know, if they got this funding, where I think it's going to take way more. It's going to take all kinds of partnerships and work with the county and the state and nonprofits or whatever to really make any kind of dent in the 0 to 30 and maybe even the 30 to 60. You know, again, I want to completely recognize that there's a huge need there and that, you know, we want to meet that need, but just being realistic. So I guess maybe what I would say is I wouldn't put the 60 to 80 as a priority. I would just maybe not say the income levels, specific income levels, that there's a higher priority. They get more points if it's.
Yeah, and I think we kind of covered that, and maybe moving over some of that language from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund stating, you know, priority for, you know, these lower income projects, but, or more points may be given if you do this, but it doesn't mean that, you know, we're hindering projects that meet the 60 to 80%.
Yeah, how we put it in the other one with the, like, look, we're going to be upfront that, of course, if someone wants to come in and do these lower ones, that we're going to consider them higher, but not a specific number or anything, just like we did with the other one, not saying, hey, you can't get these points if you're 60 to 80. Because I mean, if there was a really fantastic 60% or 61% or whatever they want to judge it at, or 75, and it was a really great project, I want us to be able to still give them full consideration.
Okay.
I'm still with you guys. I'm just having a slight migraine, so
Oh,
I'm here. Sorry.
Okay, anything else here that pops out that you want to make sure we include?
I mean, there's nothing there that I don't like, really.
Yeah, I mean, we
than the
can
little
include
caveats.
some of, yeah, we can include them.
I mean, I
but-
know
Yeah,
the first one is a dog whistle to certain people, but I think it's also important, you know, so.
I think what's important with that one is exactly how we're going to define, because if we just use historically undeserved communities, yeah, we're going to get hung out to dry on that real quick by the community. I think defining more along the fact that we're talking about, you know, specific categories, breaking it down and saying, hey, you know, we want to help veterans or retirees, or we want to help specific income levels, or if you can show that, for instance, you're second or third generation low income, you know, that you really are the kind that we want to help. You know, we don't want this to become a generational stigma thing, or, but I think if we fall into the category of basing anything off, you know, race, sexual preference, religion, anything like that, that we're gonna get drug out on it.
okay. Right, yeah, so like I said, we can add all of these things and then just tweak them a little bit to better fit. Not to say that, so that, you know, all of these different types of projects can apply. I'm fine with that. Okay. All right. Moving along. So this was just the minimum requirements. Like I said, I think I'm going to move over some of the things from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund that we also have for like that minimum threshold. But again, like Larry mentioned, project readiness, making sure that it's financially feasible. If you get the money, you can do it. That the financial need, you know, show how this is going to, you know, actually help fund the project. show where the gap is and how the money, a specific amount of money will help, minimize that gap. And then obviously they have to show that it's going to be income restricted at 80%, MFI or less for 60 or more years. So those for sure we want to add in there. And then I'll add some from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund that I think makes sense as well. Okay. So a little more of logistics. Some cities review their CET as an ongoing basis. So a project will come in at different times of the year and they'll propose, we need this amount of money because of this and this and this, and here's what we're providing. Whereas the Affordable Housing Trust Fund just opens in certain times of the year and then it closes. What do you all think about doing the option of CET funds being an ongoing basis, meaning that we want to make sure we capture projects that need the money now and can't wait until something opens, or doing it like the Affordable Housing Trust Fund? Matt?
I think that the problem we're going to run into is just the logistical issue of being able to meet and criteria and stuff on just an on-demand basis. That's not really so feasible, but I mean, we all have already made a commitment to quarterly meet, and that would be a lot better than annual. So maybe finding a middle ground of just setting a section of time for each meeting to go over the applications and such and projects that we've received in the previous 3 months leading up to that.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we have talked about whether this commission needs to meet more often as well. But I would agree. I would rather have a middle ground of a few times a year at least than one time a year. I just think you're going to stymie some, or if they're having to wait that long or something, they may be looking elsewhere. So I would like to have it. If not, if it is just too much of a hassle to have it ongoing or as needed, that we would have it a few times a year. The other thing is, the other question I guess would be, do we, like, if we do it 4 times a year, do we say there's a, this amount of money available each time, or do we evaluate projects as they come, and once we've used all the money, we're done for that year until more money is generated? I don't know if that's something we're going to talk about, or is that
We can talk about it. Doug, I don't know exactly how other cities do it. Do you have a better understanding than I do on, is it kind of just like as until the funds run out per year, or how does that work?
Until the funds run out.
Okay. What I thought.
So right now I don't have the specific number, but we've got about $1 million sitting in the account. So the purpose, and remember, the construction excise tax has a sunset provision. So by the time we get into year 5, we've got to start preparing a report and take back to the city council to see if they're going to continue this program or not. So to be, one theory of thought is, if to be successful, you need to be pushing the dollars out that you've been collecting to create those affordable housing units. If you sit on the money and wait and think, oh, the one big project, some might look at that and engage, well, you have not been successful.
Well, and I guess also this goes to my, that we could have it 4 times a year, but if people know that once the funding's gone, it's gone, I mean, that's going to push them to try and be ready the first couple times or whatever too, I would think.
Yeah, and I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. I mean,
Right.
if people are considering doing a project like this and they need a little extra push to get it done, then more power to that plan, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, me too. I think that's fine.
Okay, so I'll draft it for now as 4 times a year when you all meet. As so that middle ground that we all kind of talked about. Okay. And then there also are some cities that limit it to 1 per applicant during a 5-year period. I'm thinking just with the amount of applicants we've been receiving for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, I don't know if we want to limit that. Especially because it seems like Habitat has been, consistently being able to get those grant funds, which is great.
Yeah, I couldn't
yeah.
see possibly saying, oh yeah, sorry, Habitat, you can only have it once every 5 years. You can get help from us when, I mean, if they have a project that comes up, I want them to be able to apply. Like, I want any program like that. I mean, including like the Peace Village issues. If they're putting up transitional homes to get people off the street, and all of a sudden they have something come up, like maybe a freaking tornado hits or something they're not insured for, and they got to rebuild. I want them to be able to come to us without having to necessarily wait some exact amount of time.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, again, as you were saying, I have no idea with this. Are we gonna be inundated with applications, or is it gonna be a trickle? And I mean, my guess is at the start it'll be a little slow, just as people get to know it, stuff like that. On the other hand, maybe there's a bunch of projects people have been thinking about that, man, if there was the money, if it was worth it, I would definitely go for it. So yeah, I hate to limit it at this point. If there's people that can get these projects done and have demonstrated that ability, I'm fine with awarding it multiple times. But I also, we could certainly, if we find that we're getting lots of applicants, that could be part of our criteria is, how often or whatever.
Okay. Makes sense to me. Man, just in the wire. We've got a minute left. So as I said, next steps, I'll be drafting up a lot more of the actual criteria and requirements like we have for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and we'll go over that. And obviously they'll be more specific than our discussion here. And so then I'll provide that at the next Affordable Housing Commission meeting, and we'll continue that review. And then our goal is to have it, not goal, it needs to be presented to City Council by December. So, which is fine. We're meeting that timeline. But yeah, so
It is our next meeting for this October 11th also. I mean, are we doing the
I
two
think it
together?
is.
No, it's October
No?
25th.
Oh,
Okay.
that's right. Yes.
So you'll be able to give your full consideration to CET that
Good.
night.
Actually, that's great, because this is a
Because-
pretty important thing.
We'll be looking for your recommendation so that we can get it onto the city council, so that we can stand up the program the first of the year of 2023 and start taking applications.
Nice.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for, that was kind of a long afternoon. Thanks everybody for hanging in.
Hi guys, feel better, Joyce.
And Mary, thanks for getting us through, but not feeling rushed, but good discussion. So,
Good.
I guess we're adjourned. Do we need to vote on that or anything? Or do I just say we're adjourned?
You can just say you're adjourned.
Okay, we're adjourned. I just hit my gavel on the table. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.